Nora, could you close that door? Could you close that door? Hey, good morning. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started because, as always, I've prepared too much material for 45 minutes. So we'll go ahead and get started right on time. Good morning. I'm going to be your pilot for the next 3 months. And I want to start with a question. Does everybody have a handout? Everybody got a handout? What days do you look forward to every year?
My anniversary and my wife's birthday.
Your anniversary and your wife's birthday. Gold star. Jim wins the brown nosing award this morning. Birthdays, anniversaries, what else? Yes, ma'am.
I'm just glad that the next day but I think the Lord's Day is my favorite day of the week. Because of what He did for us.
Oh, okay. Every Sunday. Every Sunday. What else do we celebrate?
Well, in our house, we celebrate, it's Saturday mornings is like a good family time for all of us and the kids.
So we have yearly celebrations. We have yearly celebrations. We have weekly celebrations. Daily celebrations.
Of course, the kids look forward to Christmas and Easter.
Now, this is more rhetorical. I just want you to think about it. What do those celebrations look like? What's your attitude during those celebrations?
You're happy?
Joyful.
One of the things that we're going to talk a lot about, one of the things that I deeply admire about the Jewish people, is their ability to celebrate God. It's just part of who they are. Every occasion, every meal, every prayer is laser focused on celebrating God and praising God before everything else. And it's not just an intellectual exercise for them, it's also an emotional exercise as well. They don't just remember things, they re-experience them all over again. Now, this is not really something that I have in my background. I don't know about you, but before a few years ago, this concept was pretty foreign to me. But this is what we're going to talk about over the next 3 months. This is at the heart of what it means to be Jewish. In fact, if you read through and you add it all up, besides Sabbath, which happened every week, there are 37 days of holiday that God gave His people in the Bible. John, how many vacation days do you get?
How many do I get?
Anybody got more than 2 weeks? If you're retired, you're like, oh, way more than 37. Schmuck? Yeah. No. 37 days of holiday every year. And most of those occasions, God gives them this specific command. I want you to rejoice before me. And the word rejoice in Hebrew literally means to dance with joy. Dancing. God asked them to dance before Him. Now, there's something about this culture where this just comes naturally. That does not make them uncomfortable. That's just who they are. But that is not true for us, is it? The idea of dancing in church is a little uncomfortable. Why? I think we'll find some answers to that question as we study these feasts over the next 13 weeks, but I'd like to start by looking at the fundamental differences between our culture and their culture. And when I say their culture, I mean ancient Israel, not necessarily modern-day Jews. Because their culture Modern day Jews' culture is largely shaped by the same thing that our culture is shaped by, which is Western civilization. We are the pinnacle of Western civilization. We are the pinnacle of Western culture. And that is very different than what we would find in ancient Israel, which was very much an Eastern culture and an Eastern worldview. When you think of Western versus Eastern, what do you think of? What ideas, maybe what emotions come to mind?
Black and white.
Black and white?
Yeah, like I compare my years in China as a missionary to years in America growing up, black and white.
Which, of course, China is a
Communist country.
Eastern culture.
Yeah.
It's an Eastern culture. Well, it's interesting that you bring up communism. When we were talking about Eastern versus Western in the 80s, what were we talking about? We were talking about Russia and America. We were talking about communism and capitalism. That's not what we're talking about today. And this, what we're going to talk about, is not an endorsement of one culture over the other. We're going to talk a lot about the Eastern worldview over the next 3 months, but that is not the same as saying we need to become Eastern. I think God put us in our culture for a reason. I think we have arrived at the point we're at for a reason. And we don't need to be Eastern. We don't need to be anything other than what we are. I think there's tremendous wisdom in the Eastern worldview. And there's some things that we can learn, and there's some things we can say, somewhere along the way we lost that. But for the most part, this is not an endorsement of Eastern culture over Western culture. So, first I want to talk about Western thought versus Eastern thought. Western thought tends to be abstract in nature. When you think of who God is, and I say, describe God to me, from a Western perspective, what would you say? God is omniscient. God is love. God is all powerful. These are very abstract ideas. But an Eastern point of view tends to be concrete in nature. How does the Bible describe God? God is a rock. God is a fortress. God is, listen real carefully, living water. If you are a people who fundamentally live in a desert, how do you describe water? How do you describe God? He's water, he's shade, he's protection. So, abstract versus concrete. We tend to present information, we tend to communicate with proposition and definition. They tend to communicate with metaphor and word picture. You guys know who George Orwell is? 1984, Newspeak. Well, he did this really cool thing where he took Ecclesiastes and he translated it into modern English. And I think this is just, other than describing it, this is just the best way to show you. So this is the original King James of Ecclesiastes. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. Beautiful, right? Here's what George Orwell said modern English would use. Objective considerations of contemporary phenomena compel the conclusion that success or failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be commensurate with innate capacity, but that a considerable element of the unpredictable must invariably be taken into account.
Wow. Amen.
Now, which one moved you? Which one described reality? And which one left you going, huh? That's Eastern versus Western communication. Another feature of Western communication is that we tend to be low context. And they tend to be high context. What goes without being said in your families? What do you not have to verbalize? There's probably a lot, right? There's probably a lot that just doesn't need to be said. It can be said with a look.
You don't call your children except by name.
Right.
You don't say my son or my daughter, you just say Bill or Sue.
Exactly. Now think about your workplace. What goes without being said? Think about your community center. What goes without being said? Not a lot. Not a lot. And quite a bit less every single day. Because we're a very diverse culture. And so everything has to be said explicitly. Everything has to be described in detail to avoid miscommunication, because how often does miscommunication happen? A lot. There is a huge gap between what you mean and what people hear most of the time. But that's not the culture of ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, so many things go without being said, and so many things are said with these words, but what is meant is really this, because it's a high context culture. People just understood what was being said and were able to read between the lines. Another feature of Western communication is that numbers tend to be quantitative, almost exclusively. What is it they say about age? Age is just a number. It's just a number. It has no meaning, right? Who here is 70 or about to turn 70? Anybody? Yes, sir. Now, from your perspective, is that something to celebrate?
Yeah.
I would hope so. From our culture's perspective, is that something to celebrate? There we go. In Eastern thought, numbers are first and foremost symbols. Yes, they are quantities, but first and foremost, they are symbols. What does 70 symbolize? Completeness, wholeness, perfection. So what are you, sir? You are perfected. You are right where God wanted you to be. In fact, Jewish people would say that you just started a new life because God finished the old one. 70 is when you start over. Michelle's father-in-law turned 83 last year. 83 last year, and he got another bar mitzvah. He got to turn 13 again because the years of a man's life are 70, or if by strength, 80. So 70, you finish one life and you start a new one. First and foremost, symbols. And finally, what this means is that when a Westerner communicates truth, we communicate primarily with information. Right? God is love. Stephen, I'm just going to tell you that, and I want you to hear it, and I want you to believe it. God is love. But from an Eastern perspective, truth is primarily communicated through experience. If I want Stephen to know that God is love, from an Eastern perspective, I don't tell him. I let him experience it. Now, this is very much what we're doing right here, a Western setting, is it not? Because what am I doing? I'm putting definitions and propositions up on a PowerPoint screen. If this was an Eastern setting, if this was an Eastern context, we wouldn't be talking about the festivals. We'd be experiencing them. We'd go out and we would live the festivals with Eastern people. In our education environments, the teacher gives students information. And that's called knowledge, having information. But when you say you went to the school of hard knocks, what are you saying? You got all your experience the hard way. In their education environments, they told parables. That was how they taught. Now, what is a parable? Let me put it this way. I'm going to throw some images up on the screen, and you guys just very quickly shout out what you see. What is that? Passover. Great. What is that? Mount Sinai. Great. What is this? That's wandering in the desert. What's this? That's the triumphant Palm Sunday. What's this? That's the Last Supper. Have you ever noticed how much of the Bible is story? Not proposition, not information, story. It's something like 80%. It's just story. And you know what you know how often we read that 80%? Not often. Most of the time we're reading the words of Paul. Because that's proposition, definition, explanation, low context. But most of the Bible is story, and that's the way God chose to communicate, because he chose to communicate through ancient Eastern authors to ancient Eastern audiences. Now, I'm going to pause there for questions. Does all this make sense? Yes, sir.
I'll just throw out a question, I guess. So, your last sentence, he wrote through ancient Eastern authors for an ancient Eastern audience. And then, you always hear the Bible is not to me, but for me.
Correct.
So it's kind of the same kind of a concept that we need to study in the context of its original intent. But then there are scriptures, for example, in Daniel, where it says, this is not for you, lock this up, this is for later. You don't need to understand this right now. So there's also an aspect of that Bible, the Bible is for us as well. And so I'm trying to marry that. Can you help me marry those two?
I think you just said it. It was not written to us. Who was the original audience of everything Moses said? Come on. These people. Who was the original audience of everything Paul said? Give me a church, Powell. Ephesus. And yet, what did the Spirit do? What did the Spirit do with those words? What did Paul physically do? What did Moses physically do? He wrote them down. During the days of Moses, writing was a brand new technology. And so God said this. Use this because future generations are going to need this. Paul, use this because future generations are going to need this. But who was it originally written to? And is it reasonable to expect that Moses and Paul had American Christians in 2023 in mind when they were putting information down? Yes, sir.
Western thought criticizes the Bible often because you read Matthew and there are two blind men, there are two demoniacs, whereas Mark has one blind man.
We do not have time for that, Al.
I know. But the idea, though, being that Western thought is looking for scientific method and a critical, quantitative, logical progression with ideas, a synthesis, and a conclusion. Whereas so often, I appreciate you saying that, naturally, so often when you read through as somebody sitting in Jerusalem, let's say 3rd century, and I've got a copy of Matthew, I'm going, wow, this guy really makes sense. Whereas someone sitting in the Tübingen school in the 19th century looks at Matthew and John and says, these people were crazy.
Yep.
Nothing makes any sense.
Because what is not being met?
The expectations.
Expectations,
of the current culture.
Men and women, when do you get in the most trouble with your spouse? When you don't meet their expectations. We need to adjust. When we study this topic, we need to adjust our expectations. Because this is not going to be presented, I'm going to present it, but originally it is not going to be presented in proposition and definition and in abstract terms. It's going to be presented in story. All right, so I need to talk about a few quick things just to kind of set the stage. First of all, God gave, Pentecost. God gave his people these holidays. These are not their ideas. First and foremost, these are God's ideas. These come directly from the mouth of God through Moses to the people. Things like, and he did this with three different categories of ideas. First, there's specific commands, and these come directly from the mouth of God through Moses to the people. Things like dates, seasons, offerings. When you celebrate Passover, what kind of lamb are you supposed to select? Unblemished, flawless, perfect. That comes from God. And we find most of this information in just 4 chapters. I don't know if you can see that. It looked fine on my computer. I'm going to throw it up there again. It'll be a little easier to see. Just 4 chapters in the Torah is where we get direct commandments about the holidays. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at this information, but not a lot because you can go read it. What I really want to focus on is the tricky part, which are ancient developments. Human ideas about how we're going to actually implement God's specific commands. For example, do I have this example? Yes, I do have this example. So, we know that God wanted a perfect lamb. How do you do that? Specifically, how do you do that if you don't own sheep? Because at least half the population were farmers, and farmers were not shepherds. Shepherds were not farmers. They were different people. So what does half the population have to do to select a perfect lamb? They're going to have to buy it. Now, you may be getting that farmer's perfect lamb, but are you going to get the best lamb possible? So here's what they came up with. Over time, the rabbis, the Pharisees, in an attempt to put a fence around the law and say, we're going to protect what God has very explicitly said, he wants a perfect lamb, we're going to appoint shepherds who are going to raise up flocks, and from those specific flocks, every Passover lamb has to be bought. Now, where do you think those flocks were kept? A little town named Bethlehem. By the time Jesus was born, every single Passover lamb that was sacrificed in the temple came from Bethlehem. Now, did God ask for that? Not really, but is it helpful to know? Yes, it is. The third category, which we won't spend a lot of time on, is modern developments. So my family and I do a Seder with Michelle's family every year for Passover. And some of the elements are very much original. Unleavened bread, very much original. But most of them are not. Most of them were developed over time. Most of them were developed in the last 1,000 years. And so for our purposes, over the next 3 months, we're not going to touch on a lot of those. Some of them are helpful, most of them are not, because it's not relevant to Jesus or ancient Israel. Make sense? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Jewish timekeeping, because this is where I find the most difficulty in understanding when things are happening and what's going on. Because our calendar is completely different. How do we measure time in our Western civilization? The sun, we rotate around the sun. How long does that take? 365 and a quarter days, which means we have to add a leap day every 4 years. How do we measure a single day? 24-hour cycle, right? Starts at midnight, ends at midnight. every single day. Regardless of what is going on externally, that 24-hour calendar stays the same. It's very predictable and it's very rigid. The way the Eastern culture of the Bible experienced and calculated time had a lot more to do with what they could see and what they could experience. And primarily that means that they had a lunar calendar, which is 29 and a half days. Which, if you calculate a lunar calendar, that means that you'll see on your sheet, every 19 years, or not every, what is it? 8 times every 19 years, something like that? 7 times every 19 years, you have to add an entire month to get it to sync up with the solar Gregorian calendar. And the way they calculated lunar months, this is fascinating, they had this council called the Sanhedrin. You may recognize that name from the Gospels. They had the Sanhedrin, and it was their job to say when a month ended. And so what they did is they interviewed 2 witnesses, because every truth is established on 2 or 3 witnesses. They interviewed 2 witnesses, cross-examined them, who said, I saw the new moon last night. And if they established that that was true, then they said, great, that month's over, new month has begun. Anybody want to go back to that? It's going to be kind of hard to plan holidays. The other thing, and this one is probably the most important thing to remember, by far. When do our days technically start? Midnight. When do we experience our days starting? Sun up in the morning. I start my morning with coffee. But if you drink coffee at night, what happens? Yeah. Their days began when the sun went down. That will trip you up more than anything else, is not remembering when the day actually begins. Do we have Bible class on Wednesday night or Thursday night? Because the sun is down. So which night is it? By this measurement, it's Thursday night. Thank you. It's Thursday night. Here's some bonus homework. Don't do this now, but do it when you get home. Read Acts 20. Acts chapter 20. And then come back next week and tell me when you think Paul raised Eutychus from the dead. What day of the week was it? Acts 20. When was Eutychus raised from the dead? Okay, this one is probably the most mind-bending. Every hour is how long from a Western perspective? 60 minutes. 61? 60. Their hours were proportional. So how much sunlight do we get in the summer? Quite a bit more, and then quite a bit less in the winter. They divided every day of sunlight into 12 hours. No more, no less. Which means in the winter, you're getting closer to 60 minutes. In the summer, your hours are actually over 70 minutes. Are we starting to understand just how different this culture is? Completely different ways of relating to time. Completely different ways of relating to time. And then finally, I want to talk about what's called tamid in Hebrew. Say tamid. Tamid are the daily sacrifices, and they come from Numbers 28. Command the children of Israel and tell them to be careful to present to me at the appointed times, that'll be an important word later on, offerings by fire, 2 male lambs a year old, perfect, as a daily regular burnt offering. Prepare 1 lamb in the morning, and the other lamb you are to prepare at twilight. How are you supposed to take this very explicit command from God and carry that out? What is morning? What is twilight? Here's what they did. All right, so we already talked about dividing into 12. We divide sunlight into 12 hours, exactly. The first hour is 6 a.m., roughly, and that is sunrise. That's when the day begins. So the priest would take the lamb and tie it to the altar at sunrise, hour 1. Eesh. 3 hours later, the third hour, that's when that first lamb is sacrificed. And in Hebrew, that first hour of prayer is called shacharit. It's important to note that when Jews talk about prayer, what they mean is what we would call worship. I'm going to the temple to pray. I'm going to the temple to worship. That's what it means. Third hour, first hour of worship for a Jew. The sixth hour, which was noon, the second lamb was tied to the altar, and that's mincha. That's the second hour of prayer, the second hour of worship. The ninth hour, which is around 3 p.m., how hot is it at 3 p.m., Kevin?
At least 100.
Have you ever thought of 3 p.m. as being the evening? No, that's afternoon. The second lamb is sacrificed at 3 p.m. Ma'ariv is the third prayer hour. And then the 12th hour, the final hour of the day, the final hour of sunlight, again, our times, 3, 6, noon, 9, 6, those are all approximate. The 12th hour, the final hour of the day, is sunset. And that begins the next day. This 3-hour period is called morning. That's what the rabbis refer to as morning. Everything from the first hour to the third hour is morning. And so they said, we will take the lamb and tie it to the altar for 3 hours. And then we will sacrifice it at the end of the morning. And that's how we'll fulfill that commandment. This entire 3-hour period is referred to as twilight. Have you ever thought of 3 p.m. as twilight? No, twilight's like a 20-minute period right before the sun goes down, from our perspective. But that's how they fulfilled these commands. All right, I'm racing to beat the clock. In Matthew 20, Jesus tells a parable about this guy who goes out to get day laborers. And it says he goes into the market at the first hour, and then again at the third hour, and then again at the 6th hour, then again at the 9th hour, then again at the 12th hour, and he pays them all the same wage. And it says this, it says they were standing idle in the marketplace. Has that ever crossed your mind before? But if you know when the prayer hours are, when the worship hours are, what does that tell you about those day laborers? What were they not doing if they were standing idle? They were not worshiping. These are not pious people. And what does God say he's going to go do? What does he say to the Pharisees that he's going to go do? I'm going to go eat with sinners. All right. Pausing for questions. Questions, comments, concerns, clarification.
We've been studying John, Jesus went to the cross. It just struck me. It specifically said that Jesus went to the cross and he died at 3 o'clock. That's exactly.
Absolutely. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to Passover. But now knowing what the Gospels say about when Jesus was hung on the cross and when he gave up his spirit, what else was going on at the 3rd hour and the 6th hour, or the 9th hour? A perfect lamb was being sacrificed. And this isn't even Passover. This is every single day. Every single day this went on. 2 lambs sacrificed. Especially on holidays, especially on Sabbath. Rain or sunshine, this was going on. Now, one last thing. I want to just run through the feast really quickly and kind of give you a sense of the name of the feast and the time that feast was celebrated, the time of year that feast was celebrated, and what the celebration was all about. I'm sorry if this is too small. I tried to cram a lot onto one slide. The verses, if you want to look them up, are Exodus 23, Leviticus 23, Numbers 28 through 29, and Deuteronomy 16. That's it. That's all we have. We have other stories about when different kings actually celebrated these feasts. But in terms of commandments, that's all we got. Side note. How do you determine what is important in Scripture?
If it's repeated.
I think we should definitely pay attention to things that are repeated over and over again, don't you? Repetition is the motor of learning, as they say. So if God repeats it, I think it's probably important, and I think we should probably pay attention. Also, the rabbis say that all 5 books of Moses refer to the festival system. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and we'll talk about Genesis next week. All right, so I want to whet your appetite with this stuff, because I want you to see that this is more than just Gentile curiosity. Understanding the festivals will help us understand Jesus. So, we also need to understand that all of their festivals were tied to the agricultural calendar. If you have a handout, which if you don't raise your hand, and John will bring you one, if you have a handout, you'll see on the right-hand side, the agricultural seasons are listed. When does harvest happen? It happens over a wide span of time, but when does it begin? Right now. In about 2 weeks, the harvest is going to begin in Israel. And that is when, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. One of my greatest I have many weaknesses as a teacher, but one of my greatest weaknesses is I'm not patient. I want to give it all to you right now. In the fall is when planting happens. Most of the harvest happens in spring. It continues to happen through the summer, but most of the harvest happens in spring, and planting happens in the fall. And then hopefully that's followed by several months of good heavy rain, because they have a rainy season and a dry season in Israel. And that's very, very important to understand when we're talking about these festivals and what they were actually celebrating, because there's intention and there's purpose behind when these festivals occur. So the first one, everybody knows this. Well, the first one is Sabbath. Because that's the one that's given in Genesis. Sabbath happens every 7th. I almost put every 7th day, but it actually happens every 7th. What other 7s does Sabbath happen on? Every week on the 7th day, you celebrate creation and you rest. Every 7th month, we'll talk about this in a little bit, you have an entire week of rest. Every 7th year, does anybody know? It's not Jubilee, but it's... No, that's year of Jubilee, I think. Well, we'll talk about that next week. Every 7th year, you have the Sabbath year. And that is when lots of rest happens. The main thing that happens on the 7th year is that you let the land lie fallow. You don't plant, you don't harvest. This whole system just pauses for an entire year. And then every 7 times 7 years, that's when you have the year of Jubilee. Is 7 an important number? Yes, it is. Our numbers are just quantities. So the first official festival on the calendar is Passover and unleavened bread. They're used interchangeably, but they are technically 2 different days. Passover is the first month. Again, I'm sorry if you can't see this, but you should be able to see it on your sheet. Passover is the first month of Nisan, and it's on the 14th day. And we'll talk about that more in depth when we get there. The Feast of Unleavened Bread begins on the 15th day. So when does the Feast of Unleavened Bread begin? what we would call evening of the 14th. That's why they're connected, because they are back to back. The theme of Passover is deliverance from bondage. And that's closely connected to this idea that's celebrated with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is life out of the ground. That is almost immediately followed by the Feast of First Fruits. You don't see this really anywhere else in detail except Leviticus 23. But it says, the day after Sabbath, after Passover, you are to bring an omer of the first fruits of your harvest. Omer is an important word. We'll talk about that next week. You're to bring an omer of the first fruits of your harvest because Nisan 14 is right at the beginning of harvest. That week would have been when they just went out and gathered the first stuff that had headed. And God says, bring it to me. Why? Why does God get the first? This is really important. Why does God get the first of everything? He's first. He made it. It's His. He just gave it to us. But what else does this signify? If you are an ancient Israelite farmer and you've just gotten to the end of the rainy season, which means it's still storming. What happened on, what night was that? Tuesday? Monday? Big storm came through. If you get to the end of the growing season and there's still threat of storm and you take some of that grain and you give it to God, what are you saying symbolically? I trust you to give me the rest. Hailstorm comes, wipes this out, I've got nothing. Because I'm just a simple wheat farmer. So, first fruits is all about trusting God to give us the rest. Now get this. What day was Passover during Jesus' Passion Week? It's actually somewhat complicated. So when we get to Passover, we'll go through all the different ideas about this. I personally think it was the 14th, Friday the 14th, which would make unleavened bread what day? In our calendar. Saturday. Which would make first fruits what day? Jesus was crucified on Passover, planted in the ground on unleavened bread, the day when every Jew in the world was saying, God, give us life out of the ground, and raised as the first fruits of new creation on first fruits. Come on. If you serve a God of coincidences, I really don't know what to say to you. I don't. Somehow, the Holy Spirit made this work over a period of several thousand years. Now, we don't have time to go into the other holidays in detail, but we will over time. The next feast is the Feast of Weeks. We often call this one Pentecost. That's the Greek name for it. The Hebrew name is Shavuot. It's the Feast of Weeks. And to calculate this, you count 7 weeks from Passover. This encompasses the harvest season. So Shavuot is a harvest thanksgiving. But the rabbis also said, you know what else happened roughly 50 days after Passover the first time? Anybody know? Yeah, but the first Passover, what happened 50 days after that? Yeah, Moses comes down off the mountain with 2 tablets of stone. And what does he find? Does he find the people rejoicing before God? No. What does he find? He finds the golden calf. What does he tell the Levites to do? take your swords, sons of Levi, and kill them. And how many people died? Oh, see, this is important. Our number, 7. Our numbers just quantities. Our numbers just quantities from a biblical perspective. How many people die at Sinai? 3,000. And on the day of Pentecost, how many people were saved? 3,000. Do you understand now what Paul was saying when he said the law kills, but the Spirit gives life? All of that happens in the spring. The first three, or the first two, Passover and unleavened bread, first fruits, all that happens in the first month. Feast of Weeks, third month. Day of Trumpets, what is referred to today as Rosh Hashanah, is the 7th month on the first day. There's 7 again. 7th month, first day. And the theme of the Day of Trumpets is repentance. If you do a study of when trumpets are blown in Scripture, it's almost always a call to repentance because the King has returned. The Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, what Jews today consider to be the highest of holy days, actually only gets one mention in Scripture, and that's the 7th month on the 10th day. It's 10 days after Day of Trumpets. And the theme of the Day of Atonement is forgiveness. And finally, there's the Feast of Tabernacles. This ends the holiday season, and it's on the 7th month from the 15th day to the 21st. And you'll find that that's an entire week of Sabbath. God says, take a whole week off. Harvest is over. The only work, planting is over. The only work left to be done is I'm going to send rain. And the theme of Tabernacles is God with us. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. But the rabbis also said, we need to celebrate living water on this day. And we'll talk about that in about 8-9 weeks. All right. I'm often asked what my sources are. Here's some of them. If you'd like to take a picture or write these down. These are some fantastic resources for going really, really deep on the festivals, way deeper than we're going to go in the next 13 weeks. My primary source is the Rose Guide to the Feasts, Festivals, and Fasts of the Bible. If you only check out one of these, I definitely recommend checking out that one. That's a great resource. We have about 2 minutes left. Any questions? Comments, concerns, curiosities? Criticisms, sure. You can direct those to Ryan. Yes, tabernacles and booths are the same thing. Most things that Jewish people come up with have many names. Go back. Did I turn it off? There we go. We're going to talk about all the Hebrew names for all these, and then a couple of them have Greek names that have developed over time. But just know that specific to Jody's question, Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Booths, same thing. Good question. Thanks, guys. See you next week.
Yeah.